Part 2. 1. There was only darkness. It flowed like a black river that had no bottom, and it was unconfined by any shores, infinite and turbulent and moving without direction, without any source or destination. There was only darkness flowing in darkness. Then something felt itself struggling in this black and bottomless and infinite river, something unformed and embryonic swirling within the darkness. It had no eyes, just as the darkness had none. It had no thoughts and no sensations, only the darkness flowing through it and around it in a blind chaos of thrashing agitation. It was something living, something restless and alive in the darkness that flowed relentlessly like a black river in a black world. Yet even without eyes or thoughts or sensations, it moved toward the impossible surface of the darkness and broke through. I had always been afraid of the dark. Now it was all around me, a vicious and sinister presence without shape or name, and it was also inside me, so that I could not escape it by any means of flight and was paralyzed with fear. But slowly it began to withdraw, that nameless darkness, that vicious and sinister presence which is encountered only in the worst nightmares, hiding itself away once again and allowing forms to appear as if in a dull moonlight, letting in those thoughts and sensations required for the creation of a self. And as if I had been dreaming, it seemed that I had been gone forever, and as if I had been dreaming, it seemed I had been gone for no time at all. It was night, and I was in my apartment above Lillian's diner. How had I gotten there? Where was I before the darkness blinded my mind? One certainty, I did not inhabit the space around me in the same way I had before. I could move throughout the rooms of my apartment, yet I did not use or need to use a human form to do so. How could this be happening? What had been done with my body? By force of will alone, I found myself rising from the floor and floating like a cobweb in a corner of the ceiling. I could see the moonlight beaming through the old curtains of the window by my desk. Another mystery. I could now see beyond the curtains and through the window into a dizzying maze of rooms and hallways and streets and alleys, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions until I was forced to make it stop. Following this exercise, I opened my ears, just for a moment, to an incoherent choir of voices, cutting them off before I became lost in their senseless babble. There were so many frightening things, so many questions and conundrums during this dreamlike phase of an experience that I knew was no dream at all. But any answers were evasive and fled into opaque regions where my mind could not pursue them. Every time I tried to penetrate into these areas, I found myself trapped in a dead end thick with shadows, what I came to think of as dark spots where that black river flowed bubbling and viscous. These dark spots were a source of both fear and frustration for me. They suggested the presence of an unknown player in a game I was only beginning to learn. I was still my same obsessive-compulsive self. That was a further certainty, and I did not like the feeling that schemes and strategies were being carried out around me, that secret meetings had taken place behind my back, that I had been condemned for something I did not do, that I had been manipulated and humiliated, that my competence had been questioned by buffoons, my messages ignored by morons, that I had been railroaded into the status of a non-person in an organization I had served so long and so well, and ultimately dismissed from even that lick-spittle job. Work not done. Work not done. Their faces now crowded everything else from my thoughts. It was my final wish, my very special plan, to see those faces screaming and bloody and finally laid lifeless at my feet. How well I recalled all of that. But the Monday morning ballistic blowout had been canceled. In my present state, I couldn't even hold a piece of paper. 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 Why did this word echo in my mind for a moment, only to fade and die in the grip of those dark spots. How then could I wield a head-shattering USP Tactical or a kneecapping Glock 17? I couldn't even see my own face as I hovered before my bathroom mirror. I would never be able to present that face as the last thing those swine would ever see on the day of their slaughter. And then it happened. The machinery of my murderous rage was grinding its gears, burning its oil into toxic vapors, shooting out sparks right and left, shooting and shooting, until the mirror before me began to glow with an eerie incandescence. There it was, at the center of that infernal aura. There was my face, radiant with obsessive hate. There were my eyes, pitching daggers from behind amber-tinted lenses. There I stood in the full blackness of my form, and in my left hand was my buckskinner hunting knife. I raised it up and pressed the side of that blade lightly against my cheek, nearly swooning with a black joy. After this first manifestation, I let myself fade back into the shadows. I now had the ability to control the substance of myself. I would later learn to control the powers of my sight and my hearing. And there were other things, forces and faculties unheard of and marvelous, that I would soon discover. My work would not be left undone. My work was only beginning. 2. Two homicide detectives, one black, one white, both gray, got off the elevator at an old downtown office building and entered the reception area of a company that was the building's oldest and most prosperous lessee. They noted the soft lighting and expensive decor with grand piano, but did not seem intimidated in the least. Both of them had visited the old building many times over the years. As Detective White said to Detective Black in the elevator, "There used to be a soda fountain on the ground floor of this place. Best hot fudge sundaes I ever had in my life. My parents used to take me there when we lived in the city." "Long time ago," commented Detective Black. "Yup," said Detective White with only the vaguest hint of sentimental reflection in his voice. From the reception area they were shuttled up to the 21st floor, where they were greeted by another receptionist/administrative assistant who was awaiting their arrival. Marcia Lindstrom, according to the brass nameplate on her desk, ushered the homicide detectives into the office of the company's CEO, who had no personal knowledge that could aid them in this police matter, but who gave them carte blanche to move about the company offices with the guidance of a woman that Marcia called up from Human Resources. As they began descending the stairway that shot like a spine through the 10 floors of the company's office space, Marcia Lindstrom, a factotum of superior efficiency, was already on the phone instructing someone to find out the where and when of the funeral and to order the customary arrangement of flowers which the company always sent on the occasion of an employee's demise. Down in HR, the homicide detectives asked to see the company's file on the deceased, as well as the files of persons who worked closely with the deceased, along with the files of any employees who had recently left the company not in good standing. Earlier that day, the homicide detectives, to their satisfaction, had determined the friends and family members of the deceased to be poor suspects. An investigation at the victim's workplace was simply the next step in a fairly mechanical process. The two men each took notes based on the information provided by the employee files they examined. "Why don't we work this Frank Dominio guy first? Talk to his supervisor," said Detective Black. "Yeah, I know," replied his partner. "His file doesn't exactly paint a picture of the ideal employee, and the stigma of a forced resignation can really irk some people." "Sounds like you're speaking from personal experience." "I say it in confidence," said Detective White. "A guy would have to be incredibly irked to do this thing," said Detective Black, producing a manila envelope that he had folded up in the pocket of his overcoat. "I guess it depends on the guy." But the young supervisor with whom the homicide detective spoke had nothing of interest to add to Frank Dominio's dossier, not wittingly anyway. Mr. Dominio hadn't worked very long in the young supervisor's department before he handed in his resignation. "You should talk to someone who worked with Domino longer than I did. I've only been with the company about a year." "I thought his name was Dominio," said Detective Black. "Didn't I say that?" replied the young supervisor, lying arrogantly. "No, you said Domino," confirmed Detective White. "Well, I didn't mean to say that," said the young supervisor, suddenly repentant. "So what did Frank do?" "Thank you for your time, Mr. Chipmunk," said Detective Black. "It's Chipman." "My mistake." Then the homicide detectives turned and walked to their next and best subject of interrogation. "12th floor, Richard somebody," said Detective White, glancing at his notes. "Mind if we make a pit stop first?" I was about to suggest the same thing. In the men's room, which was located outside of company space and still had most of the original fixtures from the time of the building's pre-Depression era construction, the homicide detectives relieved themselves in surroundings of massive marble walls, heavy wooden doors fronting spacious toilet stalls, and deep porcelain sinks with separate handles for hot and cold water. The first to zip up, Detective Black strode over to the sink and pulled both handles toward him, cupping his hands under the single spigot. But no water came rushing into his waiting palms, only a great groaning sound that rumbled inside the walls and made the porcelain basin shake before his eyes. He backed away from the sink as his partner looked on. What ultimately emerged from the goose-necked metal spigot was a thick, oily fluid, as if the lavatory's plumbing had tapped into a black river of sewage. "It is an old building," shouted Detective White over the loud rumbling inside the walls, which by now had modulated into a beast-like growl. "Yeah," said Detective Black as he cautiously pushed back both the hot and cold handles on the sink, bringing the room back to its former state of weighty silence. "Come on," said Detective White. "We have to see a man about a murder." When they arrived at Richard's office, it was obvious that he was expecting them. He rose from his desk and vigorously shook hands with the homicide detectives, introducing himself, and then closed the door. He invited his two visitors to seat themselves in the chairs positioned before his desk, and then returned to his own chair behind it. "What terrible news you bring us," Richard said. "I can't believe it. But why wasn't there anything in the media about it?" "The body was discovered just this morning," explained Detective Black. "We kept the news people out of the loop a little longer than usual on this one, because the circumstances of Mr. Stokowski's death were somewhat unusual." "Unusual? In what way?" "From the files we examined, you were Mr. Stokowski's immediate superior for a period of some years," said Detective White. "We were hoping that you or some of the others who worked more closely with the victim might be able to help us in a way that the others we've spoken with have not." "I don't understand," said Richard. Detective Black opened the manila envelope he'd been carrying around and pulled out some photographs, handing them across the desk to Richard. "These are photos taken at the crime scene. What they reveal has not been made known to the media." Richard leafed through the photographs without any change of facial expression, which must have been difficult even for him, considering the images now passing before his eyes. Detective Black placed these images in context for the benefit of Mr. Stokowski's former boss. "Mr. Stokowski's car was found by two officers patrolling the area around the abandoned warehouse you see in the photos. Considering that it was a relatively expensive vehicle and in good condition, they phoned in the license tags to see if it had been reported as stolen." "And had it?" asked Richard. "No," answered Detective White, picking up the narrative. "The officers then investigated the warehouse. Almost immediately they came across the victim tied to an old office chair and pushed up against that wall in the pictures." "It looks like there's something wrong with his hands," said Richard. "They're not hands," said Detective White. Well, they're not real hands. They're from a mannequin, 2 left hands. Somebody very strong cut off Mr. Stokowski's hands. We're still looking for those, and somehow fused the ends of his wrists to those, artificial hands. It's fairly obvious that the killer wasn't trying to hide his work, said Detective Black. He very much wanted the body to be found in that condition, and on that exact spot, undisturbed. Do you see the writing on the wall just above the victim's head? Yes, said Richard. The letters, said Detective White, seem to have been burned right into the wall, possibly with an acetylene torch. Can you see what it says? It looks like work or word. Word note gone, said Richard. Work not done, corrected Detective Black. All capital letters. It's written very clearly if you look close. All right, I see it now, admitted Richard. But I still don't understand why you would think that I might be able to shed any light on this atrocity. We were hoping that the words, the hands, anything you see here, might mean something to you, said Detective White. Work not done seems a natural enough phrase to be used in one's workplace. Or maybe you recognize the handwriting, although I know that's a long shot. It surely is. Everything written in all caps looks the same to me, said Richard as he arranged the photos into a neat pile and placed them on his desk at a distance from himself. No, I'm sorry. None of it means anything to me. Well, perhaps you could bring this up, as discreetly as possible, with some of Mr. Stokowski's co-workers, said one of the homicide detectives as they got up from their seats. See if they can think of something. Just the part about the writing, you understand. We'd like to keep the rest of it out of the media as long as we can. Detective Black then collected the photographs and replaced them in the manila envelope. Detective White left a card on Richard's desk with a phone number and a email address where the homicide detectives could be reached. Richard began to open the door for the 2 men, but then pushed it closed again. If I might ask, Richard said, you never specified what was the cause of death. I supposed it was the hands, the trauma, the bleeding. Detective White smiled and said, the verdict's not in on that one. Most likely it was the hands. Most likely, repeated Detective Black. Then, for just a moment, Richard became as still as stone. He knew they were lying to him, but all he could do was express a sincere hope that they would soon apprehend the killer, adding, almost in a whisper, Perry was a very well-liked employee at this company. I'm sure he was, said Detective Black, who then casually flipped through a few pages in his notebook. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, and this Domino guy, I gather that he wasn't one of the most popular people around here. Excuse me, said Richard the Innocent. Frank Dominio, said Detective White, just to clarify the identity of the employee in question. Oh, yes, responded Richard without a hint of commitment to any knowledge regarding Mr. Dominio. We understand that he wasn't exactly a model employee, said Detective Black. Mr. Chipman said that you were the person to talk to about this guy. He resigned from the company yesterday? I didn't know that, said Richard. Well, as you already seem to know, he wasn't the sort who was going to be named Employee of the Month. It's true that he worked under me for some time, but you know how it is. Some people don't make much of an impression on you, and I've seen so many come and go. So Mr. Dominio was just another guy who went, said Detective Black. As far as I know, said my old boss. Now it was Richard's turn to see his interrogators turn into rock-solid doubters of his word. So how did it feel, Richard, to be left standing there as Detectives White and Black left your office knowing that you had lied to them? Lied, Richard, and not to just somebody around the office, but to a couple of homicide detectives. How well you must have known that they knew there was something wrong about you. So how did it feel? 3. I had always been easily moved to feel affection or admiration for people whom I viewed only from afar, and this is how I felt toward Detectives White and Black as I spied on them from the remote observatory of my apartment, tuning in their voices and images on my personal airwaves, keeping myself at a spectral distance from the eyes and ears of these law enforcement veterans. They seemed very good at what they did, very dedicated and phlegmatic in a way that suited men of their age who had seen the things they must have seen in their professional lives, the corpse of Perry Stokowski, for instance, and who knew what to say and what not to say to the people or swine they were forced to deal with on a daily basis. I almost felt guilty that they had no hope of achieving a successful conclusion to the case they were presently working. But how I appreciated Detective White's memory of those hot fudge sundaes he had enjoyed in the building where I once worked, not to mention the way Detective Black handled Supervisor Chipman when that little crumb knowingly corrupted my surname. But that one little word, domino, wasn't going to help those admirable and affection-worthy homicide detectives. They would still be looking at it from 1,000 angles when they ultimately declared the case, still in its infancy, unsolved. And best of all was Richard's stony look of visibly repressed frustration when Detectives White and Black had so transparently lied to him in claiming that the cause of Mr. Stokowski's death was unknown at the present time. I thought I even saw a genuine flinch of fear in Richard's face, as sweet to me as one of those hot fudge sundaes of Detective White's childhood. Of course, it would not have been possible, and certainly not desirable, to reveal the bizarre truth of this aspect of the case. Then they would really be taken for liars, or possibly lunatics. In the photos they had shown Richard, Perry's head was slumped crookedly downward in fine corpse-like fashion. Anyone could see that he was still wearing his eyeglasses. I made sure of that. But what couldn't be seen was that the red-tinted lenses were almost entirely gone. Little trace of them was found at the crime scene, only a broken sliver of the left lens that remained in those thick black frames. It wasn't until an autopsy had been performed, a show that I attended in person, that the coroner found the pulverized pieces of Perry's lenses jaggedly embedded throughout the cadaver's system. The redly tinted shrapnel had torn up the victim's veins and arteries, were jammed jaggedly into the inner walls of his intestines, and had collected into a tough little cluster, like a glass raspberry, in his aorta. "I don't get it. How did this stuff get in here?" queried the coroner. "It's as if somebody injected it into his system." "Close enough, Doctor. I deliberately left that sliver of red lens in Perry's glasses so that the comparison could be made with the splinters that flowed along the red river inside him and ripped him apart from within. Red goes into red. It made sense to me. Then again, I was insane, a monster, an inhuman malefactor with no good excuse for its abominable actions. One would think, as you were probably thinking, that someone who was no longer among the living might have risen above his earthly rage, might have gained enough perspective to withdraw from the petty games that once pinned his body to the world. But there was really no way to be sure that in fact I was no longer among the living. Even though I did not live in the usual sense of the word, example, I no longer suffered from bodily needs such as hunger, thirst, or sleep, there remained a definite material aspect to my existence. Perry certainly considered me a physical threat when he first saw me in the rearview mirror of his car as he drove away from the straight-ahead jazz club that night. When I put my buckskinner hunting knife to his throat, he felt the blade. He started begging and sniveling, and he heard my voice instruct him where to steer his jazzy little vehicle. And afterward I walked out of that derelict warehouse, alone, the way I had come in with Perry, which was the same entrance I had used on that day I visited the abandoned structure and discovered those mannequin hands and cartoon character gloves. I wiped Perry's blood off the knife and onto the right leg of my black denim pants. I noted with annoyance that it was darker than it ought to have been at that hour of the morning due to the daylight savings time change. Indeed, following my execution of Perry, it appeared to be far darker than it ought to have been, even considering that hour which was annually excised for several months from the time zone I inhabited. It looked to me, as I stood in the moonlight of the empty field beside the warehouse, that there was a blackness behind the blackness of the black sky, some constellation of black spots like stars in negative photographic exposure, which collected above me and which I felt only I could see. But although this blackness, in my perception, did seem to describe a kind of constellation far off in the galaxy overhead, I also sensed in the most intimate way that it was connected to that fearsome presence I had encountered so recently. On the way back to my apartment, this formation of dark stars, along with the fear that accompanied them, faded away to a large extent. Yet even as morning broke, there still remained some residue, in my peculiar vision, of those dark spots, leaving a kind of stain upon the sky, a dirty smear that never entirely dissipated. No mention was made of this phenomenon by the local weather reports, which I was able to check and recheck quite thoroughly using my newly gained powers of surveillance. Somehow I knew that these dark spots of the night, these stains upon the daytime sky, were not visible to any living persons. Yet I still did not believe myself to be dead. This conviction didn't merely derive from the fact that I had been a lifelong non-believer in an afterlife. I was always willing to concede my errors of opinion when sufficient evidence arose to the contrary. But no evidence of the kind presented itself, no matter how hard I searched for it. No newspaper obituary, those little boxes with tiny letters inside, had reported the death of Francis Vincent Dominio. My name appeared nowhere in any of the official records that I scanned in my own fashion. Thus, I had to conclude that I was not dead, even if I was obviously no longer among the living. This situation might have been a great problem for me if I had not been so preoccupied with other business. I still had some special plans to make, and I also knew that it wouldn't be long before Detectives White and Black followed up on their information concerning a bad apple who had hereby resigned, effective immediately, from the company where Mr. Stokowski had until recently been employed and who, now that the homicide detectives finally noticed it, had worked closely with the deceased for a number of years. White and Black would soon be asking Lillian about the tenant in the apartment above the Metro Diner. Before that happened, I needed to get some of my affairs in order. 4. Hello, idiot. The voice was Richard's and the person addressed was Supervisor Chipman. What did you say to them? Richard asked. Nothing, said Chipman, like a child who was trying to cover up some misdeed. You called him Domino. So what? Said Chipman. An expression of sly calm suddenly appeared on Richard's face. So what, indeed? Richard seemed to be thinking as he eased his weight against Chipman's cubicle counter and complacently crossed his arms, cheerfully chastising himself for having overreacted. Some people are obsessive compulsives. Richard merely had an instinct for devious caution, for hypervigilance in the cause of self-interested wile. Hey, I didn't show this to anybody, if that's what's worrying you. As Chipman spoke these words, he simultaneously slid open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a stack of papers on top of which was a page from a yellow legal pad that, in my handwriting, read, "Work not done." Oh, Christ, said Richard, kicking the drawer closed with his huge wing-tipped foot. Then he gingerly pulled out the desk drawer just enough to slide in his fingers and remove the piece of paper with the handwriting on it, crumpling it into a little paper ball that disappeared inside his right hand just before his hand disappeared within the pinstriped pocket of his trousers. "Now get rid of the rest of it, pinhead." "I didn't know I was supposed to," said Chipman the clueless. "What you don't know is going to seriously affect your advancement around here. Understood?" "Yeah," said Chipman. "Yeah?" mocked Richard. "Yes, I understand." "Good. And no more talk about anybody called Domino." "Yes, I understand," Chipman mocked back. This was somewhat unwise because now he was on Richard's list as well as on mine. I wondered who would get to him first. 5. That same afternoon, Richard called an emergency lunch meeting of the 6. I didn't exactly need this distraction at the moment, since I was scrambling against the clock, darn that lost hour, and was forced to divide my attention between the work at hand in my apartment and the lunchtime scene at the company. Sidebar. Anthropologists who once held that all human activity could be reduced to the 3 F's, feeding, fighting, and, in the present instance, a little fondling, would have been pleased to see how closely their hypothesis was enacted at the banquet table in that Gothic gallery where I used to assemble with this contemptibly familiar cast of characters, and where their lunch meeting was now in progress. Sherry popped the lid on a plastic bowl filled with vegetables sliced up into spears, but she suddenly stopped short. "I forgot to bring anything to drink," whined the sherry thing, who was sitting close to the head of the table, immediately to Richard's left. The meal that Richard had brought along consisted only of an extra thermos of coffee. He took a swig directly from the mouth of the thermos he had already opened, a shining metal silo, and then slid it over to Sherry, who just gawked at it for a moment, as if she were looking at some exotic artifact she had never seen before. "Here," said Richard, slapping the plastic cap of the thermos before Sherry's eyes, which no more recognized this particular object than they had the other. "You can use it as a cup," Richard explained. "But," Sherry started to say. "Yes, I know," said Richard with fatherly wisdom and understanding. Then he reached down into Sherry's purse on the floor between them, rummaged around inside it, and came up with a miniature bottle of vodka. He casually ran his hand along Sherry's leg before bringing the dwarf-sized bottle up to her. "Go ahead," he said to her. "Everybody knows." Sherry went ahead and daintily dumped the spirits into the plastic container, then quickly dropped the evidence of her alcoholism back in her purse before pouring in the coffee, awkwardly maneuvering Richard's shining metal thermos. Barry, the great-bodied one, removed the first of several hamburgers from a sack that sagged heavily upon that banquet table, but his eyes were fixed across the table at what Carrie was shoveling into her mouth from a field-style plate with attached covering. "What are you looking at, Mr. America?" said Carrie. "I'm just trying to identify that stuff you're eating." "It's leftovers." "Right," said Barry with a world of doubt in his voice. Further down the table, Mary sat before the cardboard dish, square and shallow, of a microwaved meal, Swedish meatballs and noodles and gravy, her favorite, although she sometimes broke up the monotony with Salisbury steak topped with mushroom sauce and macaroni and cheese. Harry wasn't eating, waving off Barry's offer of a hamburger. "I've got plenty," said Barry. "I'm sure you do. Thanks," said the inscrutable Harry. It was also lunchtime at the Metro Diner, and the place was packed. I didn't see the homicide detectives anywhere around. However, I knew they had run a check on my credit card activity, the gun shop, the clothes store, the paper? Did I buy a newspaper that night? If so, I wouldn't have used my credit card. But even though I couldn't bring into my brain any other spending I had done, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something far more significant than paper, that was also being masked by those dark spots. In any case, I knew that soon the cops would be beating on my door, and it was imperative that Lillian made it up to my apartment before they did. My tactic for doing this involved a baseball bat that once served as my only means of personal protection. Gripping this shapely piece of wood, I stood before my computer monitor as if I were facing a hated pitcher on a rival team. I wound up my swing and... "All right, then," said Richard. "As we all know by now, we have a problem." "No kidding," said Sherry. "What happened? You said that Frank was finished. Instead, we've got one dead Pollock." "These things don't always go according to plan," said Richard. "Yeah, like that girl, Andrea what's-her-name, ending up dead on your desk," said Carrie, who continued sporking a mysterious mash into her mouth. "You said Frank would go quietly. Now it's a mess." "Before you leave the room to go vomit up your lunch, Carrie, I'd like to point out that the problem wasn't with Domino. It was with Perry Stokowski. He was the mess." "How so?" asked Mary. "To put it simply, Perry wasn't quite a full member of our family." "Please, Richard, I've got enough with my real family at home. I don't need to think in terms of a second family." "That's where you're wrong, Mary," said Richard. "Let me ask you something. Who do you prefer spending your time with, not to mention most of your extra time? Those people at home or us?" Mary looked thoughtfully down at the empty microwave-proof container on the table before her. "You can't lie to me, Mary, or to the rest of us. We are your family. We are the only family that any of us have. Oh, some of you may have spouses or someone you live with, even children, but they aren't your family. Why do you think you're sitting at this table with us? It wasn't by chance, I can tell you. It's because I chose you." I had to call time out back at my apartment because I had forgotten to unplug my computer. My purpose wasn't to start a fire in that old building, but to get Lillian's attention. And no, Carrie, I would not be going quietly. I would go with quite a bit of noise and mayhem. After I had dealt with the potential threat of an electrical fire, I finally swung my bat. Disappointingly, it made only a spiderweb pattern of cracks in the computer screen. Downstairs in the diner, amidst all the lunch-hour chewing and chattering, my first hit went unnoticed. Strike one. My next swing was dedicated to Andrea and the others who had been done in by Richard. I connected well with the monitor and sent it into the farthest bleachers, where Richard sat sipping coffee from a thermos on a sunny afternoon. In short order, the monitor was just a pile of glass and plastic lying on the floor. Beside it was the keyboard whose teeth I then smashed with a lusty surge of madness. A momentary hiatus of conversation ensued in the diner below, as well as a suspension of service on the part of Rudy and the waitresses, and Lillian at last glanced upward toward my apartment. "You may have hired all of us, Richard, but that includes Perry," argued Mary. "You said yourself that he wasn't a member of this family of yours." "I said he wasn't a full member. I thought he would have become so in time, but I didn't think it would take so long to wean him off that music nonsense on which he wasted so much of himself. He wasn't fully focused on the one important thing in all our lives, the job. That caused him to let his guard down. Now he's gone. Rest in peace." "Excuse me, Richard, but none of what you're saying accounts for Frank Dominio. If there was ever someone who wasn't one of us, it was Frank. Why in the world did you choose him?" "Frank," said Richard. "He was one of the family, too, in a red-headed stepchild capacity. The truth is, we really needed Frank. Please don't take this personally, any of you. That is, each of you has your uses. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But Frank had something the rest of you don't, including myself. It was just a matter of time before he brought it to us. None of us could have come up with that." You mean that idea of his? Said Sherry. That's right. What was so great about that? Sherry continued to badger. You told us to give it the cold shoulder. It seemed to me that was exactly what it deserved. Barry, said Richard, turning to his right, would you enlighten her? Barry swallowed a cheek-stretching mouthful of macerated bread and meat, with extra ketchup. Then he held up the remains of the object in his hand. Do you know what this is, Sherry? Yeah, it's a hamburger, or what's left of one. It's also Frank's idea, but even he didn't realize that. Here's the analogy. It wasn't so long ago that some stroke of genius caused the creation of these ground slabs of beef and fat inserted between two pillowy pieces of bread. Of course, it was only some time later that the full lucrative potential of this edible invention was realized. Could any of us have invented the hamburger? Not likely. Sherry suddenly smiled, a mouthful of coffee and vodka almost spilling forth. But we would surely know how to market the things, she practically cried out. Billions and billions of them, added Carrie. Swine, 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 etc. Each utterance of this word was accompanied by a smashing blow upon the metal box of my modem. Then I dropped my bat, abandoning this primitive means of destruction, and went to work on the beast's entrails in the fashion of my newborn self, tying the transistors into the tiniest knots with only a twitch of my mind, melting wiring boards and decimating the soul of that thing, those diabolical chips, on an atomic level. Nobody was going to get into my mind through that infernal machine. And you, Richard, you knew my idea was brilliant, that I was worth more than all the rest of you. But you let me contort myself into a mass of obsessive doubt and self-loathing. Laugh while you can, you swine. Mary was in fact tittering at her end of the table, while Richard was outright guffawing in a deep, dark tone. Even Harry cracked a crooked grin. It was so nice to see such a happy family. But the magic moment died when Carrie spoke up, hesitantly asking, But wasn't there a lot more documentation to Frank's idea? Don't we need that? We'll see. Maybe we do and maybe we don't. We do want to cover all the bases, don't we, Harry? Yes, sir, Harry replied. Everyone else grew quiet. Do you think you can work as well without Perry's assistance? It'll be better without him, said Harry. It was because of him that the Andrea what's-her-name thing went badly. I never said anything. I know, said Richard. I didn't blame you. He was a worthless drug addict, said Harry. As an addendum to Harry's remark, I should mention that it was Perry's syringe in his glove compartment that gave me the idea for the intravenous mode of his murder. After Harry had finally gotten that bit of bile out of himself about Perry's dope fiendery, he looked over at Sherry and said, No offense. The eyes of the Sherry thing glared at Harry. It's not the same thing, she hissed. My name is Sherry, and I am an alcoholic. Got it? Yeah, said Harry, who obviously couldn't have cared less one way or the other. Lillian was finally knocking on my door and calling out my name. I had left the door slightly ajar, causing it to push open easily and allowing Lillian to exercise her landlord's privilege to investigate what all the noise was about in her tenant's apartment. Cautiously, she entered the kitchen through the back stairs door. By the time Lillian was inside, I had absented myself from visibility. The last thing I wanted was to put a scare into the only person who came close to being family to me. You were right to a certain extent, Richard. I was as alienated as the rest of you from my own blood relations. Lillian did draw a startled breath when she first spied the mutilated machine lying about my apartment floor. I had pushed most of the pieces aside, creating a path to lead her straight to my desk and the shoebox that was waiting there for her. She picked up the box and mouthed the words written on its lid that addressed the package to her. She then reached under the apron she was wearing and from within her waitress's uniform produced a pocket knife. It was no buckskin or hunting knife, but a businesslike instrument nonetheless. Good for you, Lil, I thought. After pulling the blade from its slot, she cut the packing tape wrapped around the shoebox, lifted off the top, and gazed upon the stack of packets which constituted the whole of my worldly worth. My God, she gasped. Quickly putting two and two together, she said aloud, I guess this means I won't be seeing you any more, Frank. Good luck to you. Lillian looked so sad as she replaced the lid back on the box and cradled the package under her arm. Before leaving my apartment, locking the door behind her with her landlord's key, Thank you, Lillian Hayes. She turned for a moment to look around the place. She could not possibly have seen me as I watched her from my niche of the non-living, but somehow she fixed her eyes, if briefly, on the exact spot where I was looking back at her. Then she was gone, and I shifted my visual and auditory attention back to the gathering in the great hall. One more thing, said Mary. I assume we're not doing this just so the company can make a pile out of it and leave us with, at most, some miserable little bonus. As the head of this family, I must withhold from you, for your own good, mind you, the full details of this venture. For now, let me just say that things are going to get a little rickety around here once Barry's plan for restructuring the company is put in place. All of this having been done, of course, at the behest of the CEO and seconded by all of senior management. There just may be a period of declining profits visited on this house due to a chaotic work environment. Soon the stockholders will begin making sounds of discontent and start pawing the ground like a herd of unfed cattle looking for some new cowboys to run the ranch, people with fresh ideas and special plans. Before you know it, we will be the company. But one thing at a time, they agreed. First things first, they agreed. And that first thing was Domino, who could queer this whole business if they didn't get to him before the cops did. That was your cue, Harry, and I'd be keeping a special eye on you. 6. I have to confess that I was as much relieved as I was enraged by the revelations of infamy that the lunch meeting of the 6 had afforded my long-distance eyes and ears. Not that they proved themselves to be any more swinish than I had imagined them to be. They couldn't possibly have done that. But my image of them had always been that of a pack of beasts whose deeds were performed somewhat haphazardly, directed by a low animal instinct that sniffed out creatures who were not of their breed and marked them for a mindless savaging. Given this conception of their brutish nature, I was naturally driven to respond in kind with plans for a very basic style of massacre, although one for which I had accessorized myself to the hilt with all the appropriate gear and suitably dark attire. Therefore, what a surprise, at once disturbing and delightful, to discover how well these beings knew what they were about. Disturbing, because they had schemes and strategies and an ambitious end in sight. They had turned out to be a tribe of true fiends, a devilish cabal, a Machiavellian mob with Richard as the prince who commanded a court of hench-persons. Delightful for the very same reasons. I found it so satisfying to have my worst suspicions about the 6, formerly 7, finally unequivocally confirmed. They were indeed a bad lot. My murder-filled mind, driven by an obsessive-compulsive engine of emotion which the non-afflicted cannot hope to comprehend, spinning itself on a carousel of fear, hate, humiliation, and divers other riderless horses of my personal apocalypse, had not gone too far in its violent fantasies. Yet fantasies were all they amounted to. Even when I began making preparations to behave in accordance with my raging impulses, which I concede were a bit overblown for having been planted so deeply within me and suppressed far too long, the situation was still at the stage of daydreams and play-acting, and the day of Domino was destined never to arrive, not as I had originally conceived it, as a bullet fest on Monday morning. Who can say if I would actually have gone through with it? That day had not only been pushed back, due to circumstances beyond my control and still obscure to my mind, however much I sought them out, it had also been drastically altered in its possibilities. Let's step back for a moment. Frank Dominio was a man of hypercharged and off-kilter imagination, no denying it, but he had always been held back by his fears and inner demons. Domino, on the other hand, was not only completely warped, he also belonged to a class of demon himself. Both of them did share many like qualities. Among these was an eagerness to get started on a project, if only to put it behind them as soon as possible. Thus, my work, our work, was not deferred until Monday but began as Wednesday passed into Thursday, EDT. And short work it was that I, for the sake of convenience, made of Mr. Stokowski. I giggled like a child on Christmas morning as I tackled each task with respect to Perry the piano player, Perry the jazz creep. Big deal if his penchant for music was deep and genuine, rather than the put-on I took it to be, and, as Harry called him, Perry the worthless drug addict. The whole business of that night was, for me, therapeutic in a way that none of the pills or psychiatric services I had consumed over the years had ever been. And that was exactly the problem. I was so satisfied by the job I had done on Perry Stokowski that I feared I might lack the will to follow through with the others on my gun shop shopping list. So where would that have left me? What becomes of an ontological anomaly, that is, my own miracle-working self, when he begins to feel that his work, in fact, is done? The dark constellations spread across the sky during the final hours of that night, along with the sooty stains that appeared when the sun rose, an hour late, the following day, did not strike me as happy portents of what lay in store for me once I had played out my purposes in the, so to speak, grand scheme of things. Hence my relief, and double hence my delight, at having my sheer ferocity of will renewed by the gang of six at their truly revelatory lunch meeting on Thursday afternoon. The game would now go on, and my salvation, at least for a time, was assured. The only consternation that remained had nothing to do with Richard's foul family, with their degeneracies and devices, their sleazy comic strip machinations, their hideous facades which hid faces that could not be countenanced. No, that was not the problem. The only source of shock left to me was that of my own lingering innocence and naivete, the fondness I had for keeping my hot head in the cool sand. I had not given those swine nearly enough credit, and my credit card could not have ordered nearly enough firepower to obliterate the things that transpired in their closed-door sessions, not to mention the ever-hatching horrors which such meetings were designed to propagate, the monstrous things that popped up and hopped about, just waiting for those doors to open onto the world. This sort of thing had been going on since doors were invented, and they happened everywhere and at all times since the first hominids got together to take a meeting. Generally speaking, expect nothing but nightmarish obscenities to be born when human heads come together in intercourse. More generally speaking, whatever is born will ultimately grow into a nightmarish obscenity in the grand scheme of things. Speaking for myself, there are no angels unless they are angels of death, and I would never again doubt my place among them or lose my resolve to serve in their wild ranks. 7. In order to function with any effectiveness in the world, you, and that includes you, are forced to make a number of absurd assumptions. Chief among these is the assumption that yours is a reasonably sound mind and a more or less sound body moving within a rock-solid reality. Even an alcoholic like Sherry Mercer could account for any glitches that occurred in her psychosensory apparatus by blaming it on the booze, something she had handled relatively well in the past and had every reason to expect she could handle just as well for many years to come. This situation had begun to change for her not long after the lunch meeting. which was the last time she would ever know anything resembling mental or metaphysical stability. "Is everything okay, Sherry?" said one of her female staff as they were talking over some minor matters in Sherry's office. "Everything's fine," Sherry replied, "but maybe we could finish this up tomorrow morning, if you don't mind." "No problem," said the young woman as she got up from her chair. Sherry opened the door and showed her out of the office. Then she closed the door once again, her hand trembling as it held tight to the inside doorknob. Thanks to Barry's restructuring of the company, Sherry was assigned a newly created position that came with a small private office. Previously, this was a luxury and a convenience, enabling her to consume whatever quantity of alcohol she desired throughout the day and to do so in quietly dignified surroundings. Henceforth, however, that office might as well have been located deep in the heart of hell, medieval, not modern, in the scheme of its decor. After Sherry had closed the office door, she closed her eyes. Then she haltingly turned her head toward that part of the wall which had been momentarily concealed when she opened the door. Sherry's eyelashes slowly parted, and her gaze was now directly fixed upon a place where the wall met the floor of her office. There it was again. There it was still. It hadn't gone away, as Sherry had hoped it would. During their meeting, she had successfully drawn the young woman's attention to that particular section of the wall. "Is that a bug or something over there?" said Sherry, pointing right at the spot. But she hadn't seemed to notice anything unusual within that space. Of course, neither had Sherry seen anything there until a few hours ago. But there it was again. Behind Sherry's office door was another door. It was small and dark and ugly, a dwarf-sized portal that bulged from the wall like a scab. Its surface was coarse and irregular, as if it had been molded out of clay rather than cut from wood. Nonetheless, there did appear to be an intricate grain running through it, swirling into the door's many grooves and gouges, curling into roughly circular knots. Sherry tried not to look too closely at the dense patterns of the door, in which she had already seen a variety of little faces and parts of faces, each of them as twisted and ugly as the door itself. But this time she did squat down so that she was at eye level with the upper edge of the door, bringing herself nearer to the thing than she had previously dared to go. Then, as though attempting to verify the nature of this phenomenon, whether actual or hallucinatory, she poised a pointy-nailed finger very close to it, ready to make a few quick taps. That was when the trouble started, because as soon as she made contact with the door, her fingernail became stuck there, caught like a fly in what seemed to be a kind of tight-knit webbing rather than wood or even clay. As she pulled to extricate herself from the grasp of the door, she found that her fingers sunk only more deeply into it and was soon trapped up to the cuticle. Of course, she might have called for any number of people who sat in the cubicles outside her office, and maybe that would have made things all right for her once more. She had no way of knowing otherwise. However, being the Sherry thing that she was, she wouldn't want to be seen in her presently ridiculous, perhaps even certifiably deranged, posture. She was now seated on the floor, her short skirt riding up her rear end as she struggled to free herself, her fingertips stuck in something that no one else could see. Then, knock, knock, knock. But the knocking wasn't for Sherry, it was for me. Detectives White and Black were standing outside the door that led to the back stairs of my apartment. Through the parted curtains on the door's window, I stared out at the two men, who looked right through me, peering as far as they could inside. Perhaps they had a warrant to search the place for my buckskinner hunting knife, which, depending on the judge they petitioned, might be considered as the deadly tool used to sever the hands of Perry Stokowski. I hadn't been following very closely the activities of these workmanlike sleuths, so I didn't know what to expect. In any case, I thought that even if they did bust into my apartment, with or without a warrant, they wouldn't have found the knife, because somehow I had taken it with me when I entered into that spooky state of being I now enjoyed. It only took solid form when I did, and, like my black clothes and amber-tinted eyeglasses, it dissolved into thin air or moved through solid objects whenever it suited me to do so. What could be more silly than a set of clothes walking around with a pair of eyeglasses hovering over them, or an unheld knife with a 13-inch blade floating down the street? So I was ready for anything the homicide detectives might have had in mind, which was something beyond my powers to know. Whatever miraculous feats I was able to perform, I still seemed to be bound by certain rules, just like anything else in this stinking world, be it animal, vegetable, mineral, vapor form, human, superhuman, or whatever else with all your imagination you might be able to conceive. Everything that exists is subject to limitations imposed upon it by forces within and forces without. There are no exceptions or exemptions, although there may be some striking transformations. Just witness what my bulked-up being was now able to do with Sherry, whose finger was sinking deeper and deeper into that ugly door. It was all my idea, my plan, at least to the extent that anyone can lay claim to an idea or plan as his very own. But how did I know I could do it? I had never done such a thing before. My original intent, way back when, was to send a bullet or two from the barrel of my Glock 17, or perhaps my Firestar, into the brain of a hated enemy, someone who had conspired to drop me into the deep end of a hell from which I did not have the power to drag myself out. By what power, though, would my finger have pulled the trigger of that Glock or Firestar? I knew that my brain would ultimately give the command to shoot, shouting out, in so many words, "Okay, finger, ready, set, fire." But I also knew that my brain took its orders from my body, while at the same time functioning as an integrated part of my body. In addition, both my body and my brain, as an integrated part of my body, were reacting to pressures placed upon them by other bodies and other brains, such as that of Sherry and our capacity as an individual body-brain unit, or those of the 7 acting as groups of bodies and brains. Not to mention the sundry other pressures exerted by objects and events that were without a human body or a human brain, including the weather, daylight savings time, insects, the entire non-human world in general. So how was it that all these bodies and brains, including my own, along with countless other non-human factors, such as the cockroaches that infested my apartment, could all coordinate in order to force my finger to pull the trigger of a Glock or a Firestar and pump some fragments of metal into Sherry Mercer's worthless brain and well-formed body? How could this task, or any other in this crying shame of a world, ever be accomplished? What precisely was the chain of command, the source of this whole mess, the line of historical phenomena which along the way included my overwhelming urge to purchase a selection of handguns and a buckskinner hunting knife, and then later inspired me with the notion of creating this ugly little door which only Sherry, and of course I, could see, and that Sherry was now stuck in up to her slender wrist? Answer: no answer, obviously. Question: withdrawn at the request of my dizzied brain. Orders to the troops: keep focused and continue the assault until all traces of the Sherry pain, like that of the Perry pain, had been neutralized. And now the ugly little doorknob on that ugly little door began to jiggle back and forth, squeaking in Sherry's ears. It was shaped something like the head of a small monkey, but Sherry grabbed the knob without flinching, her fear of what might be trying to come through the door overcoming the loathsome look and web-like feel of all those whorls and knotholes, those little faces and parts of faces. She tried to use her hold on the knob as leverage to pull her other hand free. With this action, unfortunately, she only sank deeper into the thing, which worked in the same manner as a mind trapped in a web of obsessive thoughts. The more that you, and definitely me, struggled to pry loose, the more tightly we would be held. By now, Sherry could feel the knob thing pulsing with a squirmy sort of life in her one hand, while her other was lost in a place where it was being caressed by something nameless, which nevertheless might still be described as a wriggling darkness, a black world of worms slithering around her hand and between her fingers. Her eyes had opened so very wide, those Sherry thing eyes, and now her mouth, which had once talked so much Sherry thing talk, tried to scream. But no sound came out of that mouth. There were also other effects worked upon Sherry's body and brain, but it's better that some things be carried out behind closed doors, and my attention was being called elsewhere. Apparently the homicide detectives had indeed been unable to secure a warrant to search my apartment. Detective White did rattle my doorknob rather vigorously in hopes that the worm-eaten wood around the lock might give way and allow him and his partner illegal access to the suspect's residence. If I hadn't been otherwise occupied, I would have allowed them entry, purely out of politeness. Instead, the detectives had to march back down the stairs behind the diner and were now in the process of interviewing Lillian across her counter. The place was all but empty of customers, with the exception of Harry, who was sipping coffee at the other end of the counter from Lillian and the homicide detectives. "I do wish I could help you," said Lillian softly, "but I feel I must respect the privacy of my tenant." "We could come back with a warrant," said Detective Black. "That would be another matter," said Lillian. As the detectives continued to question Lillian, Harry was now mumbling into his cell phone out of anyone's earshot, except my own. "Yeah, she's the landlord," Harry, head down, said to Richard on the other end of the line, or rather frequency, to Harry's phone. "What is she saying?" said Richard. "It's what she's not saying. She's lying her head off to the cops, that much I can tell you." Detective White was trying to conceal his exasperation with the soft-spoken and flawlessly evasive responses of the diner's proprietor. "So when was the last time you saw him?" he asked. "I couldn't say," said Lillian. "Does he ever come into the diner?" asked Detective Black. "Sometimes he does." Harry was able to tell that Lillian was lying to the homicide detectives because he himself must have done the same thing over and again during his career, as I inferred from my intrusions into the files of various agencies of law enforcement. Previous to Richard's hiring him, scouting would be a more apt term. The man I once regarded as Harry the Enigma was also known as Hank the Plumber, Joe the Roofer, and Bob the Encyclopedia Salesman, among other aliases he used for both profit, home invasion, confidence artistry, 5 prison years served over the course of 10 life years, and pleasure, several charges of molestation involving minors, majors, and some truly aged persons when he worked as Ken the orderly at a nursing home. No convictions. "She's very good," said Harry to Richard. "I'm fairly sure she could tell us something." "Then find out what that something might be," said Richard. "It might be messy," warned Harry. "So be it. Messy is fine. It's sloppy I don't need." "All right then, Richard the ringleader." The homicide detectives now seemed absolutely stymied by the fact that this old woman in a waitress's uniform was getting the best of them. "How did he seem to you when you last saw him?" asked Detective White. "I already said that I couldn't say when I last saw him," said Lillian. "Does he usually come home at a particular time?" asked Detective Black. "Maybe he does. I don't know. I really don't follow his comings and goings. I've got a business to run." "Did you know that he was recently forced to resign from his job?" asked Detective White. "That wouldn't be any of my business," said Lillian. Having been subjected long enough to Lillian's dazzling song and dance, which almost moved me to tears of thanks for her protectiveness in my favor, the detectives left their card and then left the diner with 2 coffees to go, compliments of the house. Soon afterward Harry paid for his coffee and took his leave, only to return a few hours later as Lillian was locking up for the day. Before Lillian had turned the key in the door, Harry came up behind her. Before Harry came up behind her, I stepped into Lillian's body and took over its workings, placing her mind in a state of pleasant unconsciousness while I went about my business. This was another new idea of mine that came to me on the spur of the moment. I had no special plan except to keep Lillian safe. I would just have to play the rest of it by ear, and when it was over, assuming all went well, send Lillian on her way home without any alarm in her heart or memories in her head. "Please move back inside, ma'am," said Harry, shoving a gun barrel into Lillian's back and nearly causing her to drop the brown carry-out bag she was juggling, along with her purse while she was locking up. "And I'll take those keys if it's all the same to you." Lillian had securely folded and stapled the carry-out bag, so Harry couldn't have guessed that it contained the life savings of Frank Dominio. As he maneuvered her away from the front window, Lillian said, or rather I said, using Lillian's vocal cords, "What is it you want, young man?" Harry smiled at the casual tone of the question. "I would like to rape and rob you," he replied. "Anything else?" "Yes, I would like your key to the apartment upstairs. I assume you have one." "I surely do," said Lillian. "Would you mind if I set these things down on the counter?" "Not at all." "Thank you. Now you said you wanted to rob me. Let me see how much I've got in my handbag." "Cut it out," Harry yelled as he knocked Lillian's purse to the other side of the counter. "No reason to act so rude," said Lillian. "Just a joke. I know you're not looking for some small change from this old handbag. I can see you're not just some worthless drug addict, not like some people." Immediately, Harry's attention became divided between the words he had used earlier that day to describe Perry Stokowski and the business of the moment. For a second, he froze into the pose of a classic gun-pointing hood, not even noticing that Lillian had already turned away and was headed down a hallway into the shadows of the closed diner. "What you're looking for," she called out from the darkness. "It's back here." "Hold it," shouted Harry. "You hold it," said Lillian as she opened a creaky door and switched on a light, causing a little room to appear at the end of the hallway. When Harry entered the little room, he saw Lillian standing in the corner and leaning over an old safe that opened from the top. After tuning in the combination, she pulled at a metal handle and exposed the contents of the safe. "Lots of money in here, boy," she said. "I was going to bring it to the bank tomorrow, just like I do every Friday." "Take it out," Harry ordered. "What do you think I'm doing?" said Lillian. After she had brought out the heavy cloth bag that contained the cash taken in at the diner, Lillian reached into the depths of the old safe and pulled up something else. "I imagine you'd be interested in this too," she said as she held out a stack of papers secured by a single rubber band. Harry read the words printed on the first page, "New product," and below these, "Frank Dominio." "I knew you were lying to those cops," Harry said in a self-satisfied voice. "And aren't you the smart boy for taking note of that? It's too bad, though, that you won't be able to walk away with any of this loot. Never mind the papers." "What's stopping me?" said Harry. "Well, for one thing," said Lillian, "you can't open that door." Harry quickly turned around and realized that the door which had creaked open so loudly had somehow closed behind him without making a sound. When he swiveled back toward Lillian, she said, "And for another thing, your gun won't work anymore." Harry pulled the trigger of his weapon, not a Glock, but the only thing that emerged from it was a molten blob of metal, which trickled out of the cylindrical barrel like water dripping from a leaky faucet. Then the light bulb in the ceiling began to fade until the room was submerged in blackness. These were strange phenomena in their own right, but the thing that really unsettled Harry was the sound of something bubbling up from inside the safe, illuminating the room with strangely jittering colors as it rose to the rim and emitted a vaporous stench. Harry gagged and covered his mouth with his free hand. Speaking through his fingers, he said, "What's going on? What is that?" "Soup of the day, boy. Cream of mucous membrane. I thought it might be something you'd like, you being a sexual offender and all. It does smell some." Harry was now choking and gagging at the same time. Finally, he managed to cough out a few words. "Who are you?" he said. It was Lillian who looked into Harry's eyes, a lurid rainbow of glowing colors playing across her face, her mouth grinning wide. But it was my voice that answered Harry's question. "It's me, Harry," I said. "It's Domino." I could have gone on gloating like that for some time if Harry's cell phone hadn't started chirping inside his coat pocket. This forced me to rush things, since I wanted to take that call. With lightning speed that surprised even me, I had the phone in that is Lillian's, hand. By the time it was between its second and third rings, Harry was gone. The skin of his face was still bobbing up and down in the soup as it receded down into the darkness whence it came. The light in the little room switched back on. I flipped open Harry's phone and put it to my ear. "Hoy, hoy," I said, continuing to speak in my own voice. "What?" said the man at the other end, who was Richard. I said hoy hoy. That's the phrase first put forth by Alexander Graham Bell as the standard greeting to be spoken into his new invention. Well, it wasn't just his invention, but he ended up getting all the credit for it in the public mind. That's the old story, isn't it? Especially when we, meaning you and me, are talking about brilliant and profitable inventions. Is that what we're talking about? You know that it is. "Where's Harry?" said Richard. "Work not done," I replied. "I see," said Richard. "What happened exactly?" "Sorry, Richard, but I really can't say myself what happened. Exactly. Nothing that Harry enjoyed very much, I'm pretty sure on that score. And while we're on the subject, you might want to look in on Sherry." "I'll do that," said Richard. As I stated earlier, in order to function with any effectiveness in this world, you have to make some absurd assumptions. My assumption of the moment was that Richard should have sounded far more rattled by our conversation, but this wasn't the case at all. "That's 3 guys out," I said, making the mistake of trying to get a rise out of my one-time boss. 4 to go, not counting Chipman. "You're really a very bad man," said Richard. "Yes, I am," I said, "but you can take the credit for that. That's no more than false modesty coming from someone with such an enormous ego. Too bad you never recognized that in yourself. We could have worked very well together if you had. It must be quite painful to have such big plans without being able to admit what an ambitious swine you really are." "Swine," I said, my composure continuing to crack. I had never shared that epithet with anyone at the company. "Isn't that what you thought of the rest of us?" "More or less. It's a common term of derogation." "I suppose it is. I must have heard it used around the office, or maybe I just dreamed it. I believe that dreams can be quite helpful in our lives. How about you?" I was beginning to regret having answered Harry's phone. "I think we've said about all we have to say to each other, unless there's something you'd like to add." "Like what?" said Richard. "I don't know. Something threatening, like telling me I'm a dead man, for instance." "No, not at all," said Richard. "As far as that goes, I already know that you're not a dead man, but neither are you alive. Isn't that right, Domino?" Then Richard hung up, leaving me once again with a mind that was racing with incalculable doubts and questions and, above all, fear. 8. On Richard's orders, Chipman went to see what was what with Sherry. It was just after the close of the workday, and the floor on which Sherry's office was located was quiet and empty. save for a few members of the cleaning staff who moved among the cubicles, emptying out each employee's trash containers and doing a bit of vacuuming. Knocking lightly on the door of Sherry's office, Chipman looked around for anyone who might be observing him before slipping into the room and closing himself inside. "What the hell?" said Chipman aloud. The ceiling light still illuminated the windowless office, but it was dim and flickered at strobe-like intervals. This was done strictly for effect on my part, as was the general disarray of the room, which appeared as if a miniature whirlwind had turned the place all higgledy-piggledy, with bookshelves knocked to the floor, a desk that leaned at a 45-degree angle against the wall, and the contents of every file drawer and desk drawer scattered everywhere. While there was no sign of Sherry, her purse was among the disturbed contents within those four walls. Chipman saw it at the back of the room, its strap torn off and its leather outer skin crushed like a deflated football. As he stepped cautiously through the debris, Chipman saw something glinting on the floor, something that blinked in sequence with the ceiling light and which animated the scene around him. Bending down, he picked up the object, which to all appearances was a hand mirror that had been dumped, along with everything else, from Sherry's purse. Light and shadows skittered across the reflecting surface of the mirror. This was all that Chipman could see at first, but as he inspected the object more closely, he noticed that there was also a face in that mirror, and the face was not his own, nor was it Sherry's face exactly, but it was the face of something, some Sherry-like thing, some creature from which almost every vestige of Sherry had been distilled and only the thing part remained. And it seemed to be screaming with what seemed to be a mouthful of craggy teeth that, seemingly, were trying to eat their way out of the mirror. Chipman dropped the mirror to the floor immediately, instinctively. Then he started crushing it underfoot, stomping on it with the heel of his shoe until the mirror was only a collection of sharp, glittering fragments which he frantically kicked into every corner of the room, thereby dispersing the image of something that had quickened his breathing and made his eyes stare as if they could still see the face in the mirror. Standing amid the tremulous shadows of that office, its furnishings all atilt, little slivers of a funhouse mirror still shining among the debris about him, Chipman appeared lost within the narrow corridors of dark reverie. But he was brought back to himself when, from somewhere in the chaos of Sherry Mercer's old office, the telephone began to ring. Chipman scrambled toward the source of that mad warbling sound, which was not at all like the friendly twitter he was used to hearing from the modern phones in the company's offices. He finally tracked the noise to its hiding place beneath a mound of file folders that littered the floor. "Yeah," said Chipman, abandoning the formal salutations of the workplace. "Chipman?" asked the voice on the phone. "Yes, this is he," he said, laughing a little. "Where's Sherry?" I don't know, Richard. She's not in her office. Something's wrong here. The place looks like it's been ransacked and, well, her purse is here, but maybe you should see it for yourself." "All right, settle down." "I am settled down," said Chipman. "You don't sound like it." "Well, it's just that there was something." "Listen to me, Chipman. I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to answer with a simple yes or no. Besides the condition of Sherry's office and the fact that her purse is still there, it's practically ripped apart. Someone must have—" "Let me finish. Besides what you've told me, the ransacking and so forth, have you seen, or perhaps heard, anything else, anything that might seem out of the ordinary?" "Yes," answered Chipman as instructed. "I saw something." "That's good. You're doing fine. One more question. Yes or no answer. What you saw, was it something that made you feel as if—" "Richard, I thought I was losing my mind," Chipman interjected. "All right, that's good." "It's good that I thought I was losing my mind?" Chipman said almost belligerently. No, it's good that you told me the truth. Now, I want you to go home. Leave the building right away. Tomorrow morning there's going to be a meeting, and I want you to be there. Just watch yourself until then. Can you do that?" "I think I can do that," said Chipman without a hint of conviction. "All right, then," said Richard. "One more thing." Then the phone went dead. Chipman tried to bring it back to life to call Richard back, but it was gone. Tossing the defunct receiver to the floor, Chipman said to himself, "I'm going to go home now. Richard said I should go home." Then he turned and saw what was written on the door of the office. The words were scored into the wood in precise block lettering, carved quite deeply, and they hadn't been there before, those words. "Work not done." Chipman suddenly charged the door and opened it, as if any hesitation might result in a loss of nerve that might keep him trapped in that office, looking at those words forever. But on the other side of the door there was only another door. "Work not done." And behind him there was only a dark wall illuminated by a flickering light. Chipman now seemed to be listening for something, perhaps the comforting sound of the vacuum cleaners being pushed across the carpeted hallways and among the cubicles of the company offices. He called for help, but there was no one who could hear him, because he wasn't in the company offices anymore. He really wasn't anywhere. Nevertheless, he kept calling for help, and he kept opening door after door. Work not done. Work not done. Work not done. After a while, even I could no longer follow him into that place of endless doors and darkness.